So welcome to part 2. I'm going to show you how easy it is to add puffy sleeves, whether it's on the shoulder or off the shoulder, to your shirred dresses. We're using the strapless dress from part 1, and we're going to be adding sleeves to that. And you can add both of these sleeves to any of the shirred items that we sew within this series. Next, I'll show you how to measure and create your own puffy sleeve patterns. Now you can adjust the length of the pattern. I just prefer to keep the length of the puffy sleeve on shoulder pattern 22 inches, and then the puffy off shoulder pattern at 13 inches long. You can change the length of it however you want, but for this tutorial, I'm going to be using those measurements for the length of the patterns. For your on shoulder puffy sleeve, you're going to need around your shoulder and underarm, and then around your elbow. I like to go a couple inches beneath your elbow. And then for the off shoulder, it'll be your bicep around your upper arm, and then the same elbow measurement. And mine is around 20. Wrap it around your elbow. I like to go a couple inches beneath my elbow. And then my bicep, which is around in the middle of your upper arm. I have the sample of the on shoulder puffy sleeve here. And then this is the off shoulder, so you can see the difference. And this just gives you an idea of what the paper pattern will turn into once you're done sewing this onto the actual shirred panels. And I'm going to show you the different ways that you can add the full volume to the puffy sleeve or depuff it with the pattern piece. That way it'll just make it less puffy down by the elbow. But it's up to you. I kind of like the full puffy effect of it without depuffing it at all. So to create this pattern, you want to start off with a piece of paper. It can be craft paper, gift wrapping paper, an old newspaper, something that's wide enough with your measurements for each pattern piece that we're working on. So remember the 3 measurements that I told you about. So your shoulder and underarm, bicep, and elbow. So with those 3 and the lengths, we're going to create each pattern now. So we're going to make the sleeve 22 inches long. Again, you can alter the length however you need to, depending on your preference, but I think 22 inches works for most of us. Go ahead and draw a line that is 22 inches long. I'm going to draw one a couple inches longer on each end, just so I can make sure that all my lines are nice and straight. We can make a mark at the 2 and 24. The very first line, which is going to be the length. Label this as the fold, since we're going to be folding the fabric in half, and it's going to be double the width to make it nice and puffy. This is for the puffy on shoulder sleeve pattern. Get used to writing all your notes on the actual pattern piece. It's just quick to reference. So you're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to cut 2 of these. So just make little notes on the actual pattern. Make it a habit. It's easier to have all your notes kind of on the pattern for easy reference. Before I add any more lines, after you make the fold line, I like to cut off the excess. Now this is my paper only rotary cutter. I don't use the ones for my fabric. It dulls the blades too much. Okay. So after you cut the excess, throw that out. Now this will make it easier to make sure that all your lines are nice and straight. You can line up this fold line to the ruler that's on your cutting mat. Now I like cutting on top of a cutting mat. It just makes it a lot easier. If you don't have one, it's not a problem. Just make sure that you're being extra careful with your lines not being crooked. But having a large cutting mat is nice to have. So now you're ready to add both the shoulder measurement and your elbow measurement. The shoulder measurement should be on the left side of your fold. So my ruler's starting here at 24, so just make sure you stop at the 4 to make it 20 inches long, or, you know, equal to the length of your shoulder measurement. Make a mark there. You'll add the same 20-inch line to the bottom of the pattern piece, and that's if you want the full puffy effect. Like that. And I'm going to make a mark. I'll make a mark at my actual elbow measurement, which is right here at 11. So this would be if you didn't want it as puffy. I call it the depuff mark. So this will be 11 inches, or your actual elbow measurement. And then this will be the full width, which is equal to your shoulder measurement here. And I'd actually make a note here saying 20 inches. And then when you're done, it should be twice this width, which will equal 40 inches. So just keep that in mind, that this pattern is going to be half. This pattern will be half the width of your actual pattern piece, but it's just doubled. And that's what gives it the puffy effect when you're wearing it. All right, so we got the main measurements done. So you'll have your shoulder measurement up here on the left side of the fold. This will be 22 inches long for the length. Again, you can change this if you need to, make it longer or shorter. But I like 22 inches. I think it looks fine on most of us. And then the bottom will be equal to the shoulder measurement as well. So the total will be 20 inches too. But if you didn't want it as puffy, you would stop right here at 11, because that's still going to be 22 inches total width. So really it's up to you. For this example, I'll be using the full length and full width without making any adjustments. So after you're done adding these measurements, you'll connect the edges of the top and bottom measurements right here. It doesn't have to be perfect, just do your best to keep it as straight and even as possible. And that's what it'll look like. So to add the actual armhole opening, we'll take the left side of the fold, meaning the side that you have your shoulder measurement. This corner is where we rotate. This is where you make the marking for 4 inches from the corner in, and then 6 inches down. So again, this will be made at the top of the shoulder. So you'll know because your fold line's here, top shoulder, and this actual corner over here on the right. From this corner in, make a mark at 4 inches, and then from that same corner down, 6 inches. And then you connect both marks, and this will be the armhole opening. And then after you're done sewing, this will actually be the line that you use to cut off the excess shirred pieces. So you don't have to cut 4 by 6 on the actual shirred piece. It's only from the actual pattern before we do any sewing. So go ahead and cut everything out, and make sure you cut this angled part out first. This is what the pattern piece will look like. And again, if you did want to make it less puffy, all you'd have to do is connect where you made that deep puff mark, which is really just your actual true elbow measurement, to the underarm armhole opening corner up here. So where you made that mark that was 6 inches down from the top corner, connect that to the deep puff mark. And then just connect those two. And if you didn't want to cut that, you can just fold it under. And that way it's 2 patterns in one. You don't have to cut and make a whole second pattern. I think it's a lot easier just to have 2 in 1 instead of cutting it off and then creating a whole new pattern. It's easier that way. So yeah, this is how you make the On Shoulder Puffy Sleeve pattern. It's really easy. It's just based on a few different measurements, and this will apply to any size, meaning like if you were making it for an adult or a kid, same idea, just as long as you have the measurements and the length, which you could obviously alter if it's for like a smaller kid size. But this is the basic gist of it, so I hope that explains that. I know I had a lot of questions on my TikTok and Instagram versions of this, so I hope this was an easier way to learn and get this in detail. But yeah, so you can use this puffy sleeve pattern for all the rest of the shirred pieces that we're making in this series. Super easy to make, so keep that aside. And next I'll show you how to make the off shoulder puffy sleeve pattern. The off shoulder puffy sleeve pattern is very similar to the on shoulder one. Same idea. We're going to start off with drawing the length, and the length of the off shoulder pattern is going to be 11 inches. So draw the fold line, length of 11 inches. I'm making my mark at 3, and then 14, and then write down fold like we did before. Now again, my bicep measurement was 12 inches. So depending on what your bicep measurement is, you'll make sure that the 12 is up here and then your elbow measurement's down here. So, but first let's cut the fold line. Go ahead and line it up to the ruler. So just like before, on the fold line to the left will be the top of the bicep measurement for the off shoulder pattern. So we're going to make a line from the fold line out 12 inches or your bicep measurement. Do the same on the other end. For me, it was 11. And then connect the two ends of both lines. And then you'll make your marks. So this top was 12 inches for the bicep measurement. So the top is 12 inches. The bottom here is 11. This will be your bicep. So if you want, you can even label it so you know. You should just keep making notes, whatever helps you remember everything, and then call this the Off Shoulder Puffy Sleeve pattern. My handwriting is horrible. It's okay. As long as you can read it, that's all that matters. Again, make a note that it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you'll cut 2 of these on the fold. And just like before, you will add a corner at the top of the actual sleeve like you did before. From the upper corner, you'll go in about 2, I would say like 2-3 inches at the most, and then you'll still go down 6 inches like you did before with the off shoulder. You won't have to take as much in for when you're attaching this to the actual shirt piece for your armhole opening. We'll make a mark, but this time we're going in 2 inches, down 6 inches. Like that. And then you'll connect both those marks. So this will be where the armhole opening is on the off shoulder puffy sleeve. And if you want, you can even mark it, say like armhole opening. So now we're going to cut all the way around. And that's how the off shoulder puffy sleeve pattern should look after you're done. So now you have both your on and off shoulder puffy sleeve patterns ready. So before we cut any fabric, just double check all your measurements and make sure that you have everything correct before we start cutting fabric. So if you don't feel like making the paper pattern, I'm going to share a really quick, lazy method of getting the puffy sleeve pattern pieces. So let's say you cut your front and back panel pieces of your shirred fabric. Take the fabric and fold it in half, and then from the bottom, cut 22 inches up. And you'll do that to the front and the back pieces. Without the pattern, you can cut directly onto this piece and get your little armhole opening out. So make sure that you fold it in half, and on the end that isn't the selvage, meaning the edge of the fabric, your fold should be on your left side, and the right side should have both layers of fabric open like this. Lay it nice and flat. Line it up to a straight edge, and you'll repeat this for both pattern pieces. So go in 1, 2, 3, 4, and then down 6 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we're going to match both those marks. And this is if you don't feel like making a pattern. I think this is a quick, lazy method. Cut that off, and then there you go. You have your puffy sleeve without having to make the pattern. You can just cut it directly from the fabric towards the bottom of your front and back dress panels. Do that for both pieces. And that is the lazy, quick method if you don't feel like making a pattern, and you can just cut directly from the actual dress. This is what I'll be using for the mini version. If you did have enough material, you would just take it and then fold it so that you have enough for 2 layers. Because you could use this pattern for other materials, not just the pre-shirred fabric from Joann. So you'd match the fold line to the fold line of the pattern, and then you would add pattern weights like this. and then you would just cut around and then cut 2 of these on the fold from the fabric. You can either cut it this way with your actual pattern that you just made, or do the lazy quick method of just cutting directly from each of the front and back dress panel hems. Now I have both the front and back pieces. It'll be more of like a knee or even like midi length on me. I won't have enough to cut pockets out of this dress piece, so I'm going to use it from the second one where I'm doing the off shoulder. We're going to set aside this dress with the lazy version of the On Shoulder Puffy Sleeve pattern pieces. Keep that aside. And then same as part 1, straighten the grain. I'm going to cut this in half. Get rid of all the extra loose thread. So now we have the second dress that I can make with the off shoulder pattern pieces. And I'll have enough to cut pockets out of these too for both dresses. Alright, so like before, we're going to take each dress panel, fold it in half, and then lay it flat bottom of the dress and line up to the fold around the length that you'll need. And then we're not going to cut the actual pattern out, we're just cutting a strip of the front dress panel or one of the dress panels that's close to the length of the pattern. And you'll cut the same length on the other dress piece as well. Use that piece you just cut off as a cutting guideline so you have equal parts. Just keeps the length of your dresses consistent. I'm actually going to use the pocket piece. Since we're kind of short on fabric, I'm going to use the pocket piece that I used in the shortened mini dress from part 1. That way we won't have to cut as much for the pocket piece for this one since we're kind of short on fabric. Now we can cut the off shoulder puffy sleeve pieces out. So fold the fabric. Make sure you have a fold line right in front of you. Take the pattern piece, make sure the fold line is on the fold of the fabric. Put some pattern weights down, then cut 2 of these out. Let's do a second one. Cut that on the fold like you did before. Okay, so now you have this much left. Keep that aside. So now we have both the off shoulder puffy sleeve pieces cut. Keep those aside. And now we're going to want just enough for pockets. So we're going to cut them off from the bottom of the dress pieces. Since we're making these into minis, I'll have enough to cut pocket pieces from the bottom edges of both front and back dress panels. And I'm using the pattern piece for the pockets that I've shortened, so I wanted to use as much fabric. And I still have plenty of length for the skirt of the dress. So let's cut about 9 inches off both the front and back dress pieces for the pockets. Just repeat on the front and back panels of the dress. Keep all the scraps to the side. You'll need them later. You can cut these one at a time, but I don't mind layering them together to cut. It just speeds up the whole process. After these are cut, now you have pocket pieces for the off-shoulder puffy dress. And just like I told you in part 1, we're going to make little 1-inch snips to add the hidden pockets to the front and back dress panel pieces. For my puffy sleeve on shoulder one, I have just enough to make pocket pieces from the front and back dress pieces. Because usually if I stay around 23 inches, it's a good length for me. You know, I have a short torso, so I can go a little shorter than usual, and that is within the 9 inches that I need for a pocket piece, so it's perfect. But if you wanted a dress that was longer, obviously you'd have to get extra yardage. Cutting them out together at the same time again. So now we have all the pieces that we need. We have hidden pockets for both dresses, the sleeves cut out for them. Hold on to the scraps, they're just good to have for test sewing and practicing. So this was minimal waste from what we just cut off of 2 yards of this fabric. And I really love this print. I think it's so pretty for summer. It's a really cute print for year-round. You could style this in so many different ways. Anyways, for both of these puffy sleeve dresses, I will be using a combination of serger and sewing machine, but I'll have a whole separate sewing machine only tutorial for this style also. Just like in part 1, we're going to serge around the outer edge of the entire hidden pocket, except for the armhole opening. So we're serging all the way around on all 4 hidden pocket pieces. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the serged edges of the hidden pocket since I'm using the shortened pattern. And I'll be using white thread throughout this tutorial so it's easier to see as a contrast. For your project, you want to use matching thread. And just like in part 1, you'll serge down the side seam to attach the hidden pocket to both the front and back dress panels. So this step is optional, but I think it does look nice and it neatens up the raw edges. At the top of the armhole opening, which is going to be the top of your shoulder, go ahead and serge across the entire top edge a 1/4 inch, just to neaten up the raw edge. Do that to both puffy sleeve pieces. It will look like this when you're done. So it's nice and neat. Again, this is optional, but I think when you have a serger, this just makes it look more professional and gives it a nice finish instead of leaving the edges raw. And so you'll do this to both sleeve tops. And now add the same 1/4 inch serge seam to the bottom of the sleeve, opposite side of where you just added that serge seam, which would be right where your elbow is going to be. Go ahead and serge off 1/4 inch and do that to both sleeves. This is what your pieces should look like so far. Just like in part 1, you should have the hidden pockets serged on to the side seams. Just like I showed you in part 1, you'll take both the right sides of the front and back dress panels, and then you'll sew on the outer edge with a straight stitch on your sewing machine. And you'll use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you'll repeat that on both sides of the dress, and then keep that aside. So this is what the sleeve should look like. At this step, you should have a serged edge at the top of the sleeve and along the bottom of the sleeve on both your puffy sleeves. And then next, we're going to add a basting stitch line all along the top edge, 1 inch away from the serged top. And then we're going to add a 1 inch basting stitch along the bottom sleeve cuff opening. After you sew the side seams, like I showed you in part 1, go ahead and set the dress aside. Like I mentioned, we're going to add a basting stitch to the top and the bottom of the sleeve, and it'll be 1 inch away from the serged edge of both the top and the bottom of the sleeve. And you'll know you're on the right side because the angle will be going up and this will be shorter than the sides. At the 1 inch mark, you don't have to back stitch, just add a simple straight basting stitch down the entire side. Add this basting stitch 1 inch away from the serged edge at both the top and the bottom of the sleeves. Now we're going to add the basting stitch to the bottom of the sleeve, 1 inch away from the serged edge. That's what it will look like along the bottom, like elbow side of the sleeve. This is what the top of the sleeve will look like with the basting stitch. And now that basting stitch will be your little folding line for the elastic casing at the top of the shoulder and at your elbow. It's nice to add a basting stitch anytime you have to do a fold, like you do at the hem. If you were to use just a sewing machine and you wanted to hem without having to use an iron, it's just a faster way to create a fold line if you don't feel like ironing. So you go ahead and fold down. And I like to add some pins or clips, whichever method you prefer. I just find this method so much faster. And you can press this if you'd like, totally up to you, but I prefer to just use the basting stitch as a fold line, and it just speeds up the process where I don't have to stop and then warm up the iron. This way I can just easily pin and finish off both the top and the bottom edges of the sleeves. So this is what the top of the sleeve will look like, and this would be the spot that's over your shoulder, and we'll be adding the elastic in between this little channeling right here. So you're going to add a straight stitch from here all the way down along, and I would say keep the stitch right along the inner edge of that serge seam, and that's the best spot to make sure that you have the casing sewn down nice and secure. Because we're using a 1/2 inch wide elastic, this is why we have a 3/4 inch wide elastic casing at both the top and the bottom of the sleeve. Because once you start gathering, you don't want the casing to be too tight. So you never want it to be the same width of the elastic that you're working on. You want your casing to be about at least a 1/4 inch wider than the elastic that you're using. Just keep that in mind in the future. And that's how it'll look. Now you can go ahead and seam rip the basting stitch out. Again, I'm using white, so it looks kind of weird in the tutorial, but if you're using matching thread, that'll just disappear and blend in. So you'd want to use like a navy blue with this floral print if you were actually working on it for yourself. I'm going to keep them in just because it's a sample and so you can see it better. Well, look how nice that looks. Nice and clean. And you didn't have to press. It's just a faster way using that basting stitch. And let's do the same thing to the bottom of the sleeve. And I'm actually not even going to use pins because this is a pretty straight line to fold and sew down. So again, you're adding the stitch along the inner edge of the serge seam at the bottom where you'll have your elbow. And this is how the bottom of the sleeve will look. And this will be where it sits around your elbow, like a few inches beneath. So repeat these steps on the other sleeve. On the shoulder and the bicep and elbow for both the on and off shoulder puffy sleeves, I like using a 1/2 inch wide knitted elastic like I have here. It's nice and soft. You can order these pretty much anywhere online nowadays. And here I have a quick guide on how to cut the proper length. So on this guide, I'm using my measurements, you'll be using yours, and you multiply each one by 0.75 to get the proper length to cut for your elastic. I find that multiplying your measurements by 0.75 is a pretty close and comfortable tightness for the elastic. So I have my elastic pieces cut here. I like to keep them organized by just clipping them together. So this will be my elbow elastic. These two are for my bicep. And then these two, which are the longest, is for my shoulder and underarm. You can kind of label them if you want. So once you cut those, put those aside. So using either a safety pin or a bodkin, now we're going to loop through the elastic through the casing. So with the elastic that's cut for your shoulder, you're going to take one piece, attach the bodkin to the one end, and to the top of the puffy sleeve where you made that casing, and it'll be at the top of the angle of the armhole opening. Go ahead and feed the elastic through. And then make sure that you don't lose the tail. And so what I like to do is clip towards the bottom. I like to make sure that I put at least 1 or 2 clips. It keeps the elastic nice and secure so you don't lose it within the casing while you're pulling it through to the other end. Okay, and then just gently work that through. And now you can see it has a nice gathered effect and the puffy sleeve is coming together. So once you get to the other side, go ahead and remove the bodkin. Try not to lose the end of the elastic. All you have to do is match up the elastic to the edge of the top of the sleeve. And then you want to clip that. Add 2 clips if you need to, like that. So this is what the top shoulder will look like for both puffy sleeves for on the shoulder. And then make your adjustments on the other end because you only need the elastic to be right up against the edge of the actual fabric. So just carefully make the adjustment like this, and then clip. And an extra step that I like to take, but it's optional, I like to add a little basting stitch right here on the ends of the elastic. Go about 1/2 inch in from the edge. Do a couple back and forth rounds of stitching right here just to secure the elastic. And it'll look like this. Trim the excess. And I think it's just a nice little extra basting stitch to secure the elastic into the casing. Do that on both sides. So you see you don't have to worry about the elastic popping through and losing it within the casing. So now they're secure. It will look like this. That's one side. That's the other. And now repeat this on the other sleeve too. Now the other end, you'll be feeding through the elastic that would be for your elbow. the same way that you just put the shoulder elastic in. So take one of your elbow elastic pieces, same thing as before, grab one end, secure it with the bodkin or safety pin, and then just feed it through from one side of the elastic casing for your elbow. And again, make sure that you don't pull through and lose the tail. So go ahead and secure and anchor that one end while you're feeding it through to the other side, like this. And just keep feeding it through. Don't lose that tail. Do the same thing where you add little clips to secure it, and then we're going to add a straight stitch to secure the elastic so it doesn't slip around while you're sewing the sleeve together. So same as before, go ahead and sew about a 1/2 inch in from the edge to secure that elastic within the casing so you don't lose it while you're sewing the sleeve together. So it will look like this, nice and secure. And do it to the other side. Now you can see the puffy sleeve come together. Once you add the basting stitches to the elastic, it should look like this, and it should be nice and secure so you can kind of try it on now before we close up the sleeve. And so after you secure the elastic, you're going to fold the sleeve so that the right sides are touching. So you're going to match up both the bottom of the elbow and to the bottom of the armhole opening, so the bottom of that little angle cut that we made. So you're going to have the right sides together. I like to start sewing from the underarm of the armhole opening, so the bottom of that angle. So make sure that the side that has the shoulder elastic is on your left hand side, and that way you know that you're sewing the sleeve down correctly. At the armhole opening with right sides together, serge from the bottom of the armhole opening all the way down and close up where the elbow meets. So just one simple straight stitch down to close up the sleeve. So you can either pin or clip this. It's up to you. And so you'll repeat these steps on the other puffy sleeve. Then we can go ahead and serge a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the edge to close up the sleeve. When you get close to the sleeve opening, I like to take my fingers and kind of secure both the elastic pieces together because you don't want any shifting to happen when you're serging. And it'll look like this when you're done. And again, you can use either a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch seam allowance here at this step. Either one works fine. I like to tuck in the tails from the serger, and then I add a little extra stitch because this is a stress point. Sometimes you can have a little bit of loose threads right here. At the bottom of the sleeve, I like to add a little reinforcement stitch right along the bottom edge where the elastic is because it is bulky and it's a stress point because it'll be stretching a lot when you're wearing it. So add a little straight stitch right here, right on top of that serge seam where both elastic pieces are serged together. It'll look like that. And again, you're going to have matching thread so you won't see this as obvious as mine with the white thread. I think it helps, especially if you plan on wearing it for a long time. So this is the step that I have had the most questions on with how to attach the puffy sleeves onto the actual dress. So grab your strapless dress with the hidden pockets and the side seams completely sewn together like here. You want to make sure both your side seams are here because you're going to be using the angle from the top of the armhole opening to cut the excess shirred panel off. So you'll take your puffy sleeves, flip it inside out. Look how cute that looks. It's coming together. You're going to take one of your sleeves, match up the top and the bottom of the armhole opening, make sure everything's nice and flat, like this. And now with these pressed together, and everything's nice and flat, you're going to use this angle as your cutting guide. So you'll have your dress like this, laid down flat with the side seam here. Take your puffy sleeve, line up the top of the shoulder elastic, match those up, and with the bottom of the armhole opening, nice and flat, you take this, line up the bottom of the armhole opening to the side seam of the dress, line up the top of the shoulder elastic to the top of the dress. And then you can make some adjustments just to make sure it's nice and flat and lined up. You see how there's like a tiny little sliver right here that you will be cutting off because you're lining up top of the puffy sleeve, shoulder elastic. So this should all be nice and flat up against the top of the dress. And then this will have a nice angle, and the armhole opening base will be lined up right against the edge of the side seam. You'll be cutting from this base all the way up using this angle from the armhole opening on the sleeve as your cutting guideline. So while pressing this down, take scissors and go ahead and cut up along that line, like so. This is the only portion you'll be cutting off. You're not concerned about the size or the measuring for this little shirred panel. You want to make sure that your pattern for your puffy sleeve is lined up perfectly up against the top of the dress panel and then along the side seam. And that's how you know you have the perfect angle for your armhole opening and for the sleeve to be attached to the dress. Same thing on the opposite side. Line up the base of your armhole opening to the side seam, and then make sure that your sleeve is nice and flat. Line it up against the top of the dress. And you can take your time at this step because you do want to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly and that you're not cutting off too much. So make sure that the top of the shoulder is lined up with the top of the dress, and that the base of the armhole opening is right here at the side seam. So these are dress pieces that you're cutting off, just a little bit of the corner. So that's how it should look. And now you're going to line up the sleeve opening like this. So where the underarm opening is, at the base of that angle on the puffy sleeve, you take one of the side seams, either pin or clip it, and then pin it all together along the top of the dress. And it should match up perfectly because you cut it at the same angle. Clip or pin along that armhole opening that you just cut on the dress, and you see how it just matches up perfectly. And you shouldn't have to like pull or stretch anything. This should match up perfectly with what you just cut. I like to add a little extra clip here just to straighten out the gathers at the top. Now do that to both sides to look like this when you are ready. So again, take your time. And then we're going to add the other sleeve. Same thing. Base of the armhole opening from the puffy sleeve lined up to that side seam. Clip it at the center and match up both sides. Alright, so this is how it should look. So you have both puffy sleeves pinned or clipped to the actual dress shirred panel. And now with the 1/2 inch seam allowance, you're going to stitch from this one side all the way to the other. Make sure to back stitch at both ends, and that's how you attach the puffy sleeve to the bodice. So sew along the armhole opening with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Back stitch at both ends. And take your time, make sure nothing's bunched up. And then rotate towards the base of the underarm. Trim off the excess. Tuck this serger tail back in. And you can actually serge over this if you want. Now this is optional. I'm fine with leaving kind of like the unfinished edges on the inside of the garment like this. But if you want, you could serge along this just to cut the excess off. Totally up to you. And then we'll trim off excess tail that was from the shirred bodice. So that's what it should look like. And then we'll repeat that on the other side. And just double check both layers, make sure there's no bunching. And take your time at this step, just make sure nothing's too bunched up underneath. So now all we have to do is hem the dress, and I showed you how to do that in part 1. This is what it should look like. Look at how beautiful the puffy sleeves look. I think it looks like it's store-bought. You can make this pretty much in any size easily for adult or kid sizes. Just make sure you have the measurements correct and you can alter the lengths. Since we're making both the off and on shoulder puffy sleeve dresses for this tutorial, you do want to cut 4 total elbow elastic pieces, but if you were just making 1, just cut 2. The off shoulder puffy sleeve dress will have the similar start. Add the hidden pockets, sew the side seams, and then put the dress aside. We'll grab that later. You'll take the off shoulder sleeves, and just like the on shoulder ones, you're going to serge 1/4 inch along the top and the bottom of the sleeve. So you'll serge along the top of the sleeve and the bottom of the sleeve with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do that to both sleeves. And it should look like that on both the top and the bottom of the sleeves. We're going to add a 1-inch basting stitch, just like we did to the puffy on shoulder sleeves. So 1 inch away from both top and bottom of the sleeves, like we did before. It'll look like this, just like we did for the puffy on shoulder sleeves. Very similar steps. And just like we did with the puffy sleeve casing, we're going to fold down from that basting stitch and then sew along the inner serge seam to create the elastic casing for both the off-shoulder bicep elastic and the elbow elastic. So you can see it's very similar to the on-shoulder puffy sleeve, just a few differences. Look like this when you're done. So do that to both ends and on both sleeves. So I'm actually going to add 2 inches to my elbow elastic measurement since I'm using a sleeve that's slightly shorter. And you can do that too, depending on how long or short you go. Just keep that in mind that you will want to change your elastic length. Depending on how long you made your sleeve length, you'll want to alter your elastic length as well. It'll only be different by like a couple inches at the most, but make sure that you try it on and test out the elastic around your arm and see where it's most comfortable. So it'll look like this. So very similar to the puffy on shoulder sleeve, you'll have your basting stitch with the casing for both the top and bottom elastic for your bicep and your elbow. So I have my bicep elastic here. So because I made the puffy sleeve a little shorter in length, I'm going to add 2 inches to my elbow elastic. So just like before, we're going to take 1 elastic each for the elbow and the bicep elastic and loop it through with a bodkin or a safety pin. I'm using a bodkin for this tutorial. Like I did before, tighten it up and then feed it through. And like before, make sure that you clip the one end down while you loop it through the casing so you don't lose the tail within the casing. I like to add 2 clips. Okay, and then when you feed it through, anchor both ends with clips so you don't lose them. And you'll do that for both top and bottom of the sleeves. And I'll take the elbow elastic and feed that through the bottom. Okay, so that's what it'll look like when you initially loop both sides of the elastic through. And just like before, you want to add a little basting stitch to anchor the elastic on both ends of the openings. So add a basting stitch along about 1/2 inch in, and that should anchor your elastic nice and neat. As you can see, the off-shoulder puffy sleeves are very similar to the on-shoulder puffy sleeves. I figured it'd be easier just to combine them for one tutorial since they're so similar. And you can see it's starting to look nice and puffy, like this. with the angled end at the top in your left hand. With the right sides together, you'll close up the sleeve like you did before. So from the base of the underarm opening to the elbow opening, we're going to serge with a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I like to just add an extra clip at the top just to keep the sleeve nice and flat, so that when you're serging, it's just a lot quicker to make sure that your sleeve is nice and flat and isn't too bunched up. So your sleeves will look like this. So again, make sure that your bicep elastic is at the top. You'll know by the little diagonal opening of the casing. And then line up the right sides together to close up the sleeve. And so at the base of the underarm opening down to the elbow elastic, you'll add a serge seam of either a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch seam allowance. From the base of the armhole opening, we're going to add a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch seam allowance serge seam. Tuck in the tail back into the serge seam you just made. And then you can add that reinforcement stitch right along here with your sewing machine. Do this to both sleeves. So now we can add the reinforcement stitch to where the elbow elastic serge seam is. And now we'll flip these inside out and attach them to the dress bodice. So we're going to add the off-shoulder puffy sleeves just like we did with the on-shoulder puffy sleeves. It'll just be a smaller angle that we're cutting. So you're going to match up the top of the armhole opening, which will be both ends of the elastic for the bicep. Make sure that everything's nice and flat. The bottom of the armhole opening will line up to the side seam, and then the top of the bicep elastic will line up with the top of the dress. And just make sure everything's nice and flat underneath it. And just like before, the entire top of the sleeve should line up with the top edge of the dress, and then line up the bottom of the armhole opening to the side seam, and then cut along that angle. Like that. That's all you'll cut off. Repeat that on the other side. There's that. And if you want, you can add pattern weights to the other side. And those are the 2 little bits you'll be cutting off. And just like you did for the on shoulder, you will match up the armhole opening at the base to that side seam of the dress, like so. Line up the top edge of the sleeve to the top edge of the dress on the front and the back, and then pin along the entire armhole opening. And again, if you cut it correctly and everything lined up, they should be able to line up perfectly together when you're pinning them like this. Repeat that on the other side. Base of the armhole opening lined up to the side seam. So this is again very similar to the on shoulder puffy sleeves. You'll just be sewing along the armhole opening with a straight stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure you back stitch on both ends and then hem the dress, and then your dress will be finished. And then you'll hem the dress, and when you're done, it should look like this. And you just made both the puffy on and off shoulder dresses. And there's so much you can do with this pre-shirt fabric from Joann.